Good evening and welcome to this first of a number of lectures on starting a business. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and I'd like to thank Claire Joubert and Maria Nicolou for making it happen. There are really only two good reasons for being asked to do something like this. One is having already delivered a fantastic business success, and the second is being in the trenches trying to make one happen. I'm very sorry that I'm here with you tonight for the wrong of these two reasons, which is the second one. But hopefully, what will make it a little bit more interesting is the fact that these two companies that Claire just mentioned are actually being created using intellectual property, which has been exclusively developed within an academic environment, and they have been built by someone who is a full-time academic. And I hope that that enables many of you to relate to some of the challenges that I will be describing moving forward. What makes these two companies exciting is that they are still at relatively early stages in their development. Organox was capitalized in 2009, and Oxonics was capitalized in 2014. And so that you can understand a little bit about where I'm coming from with these experiences, I'll tell you a little bit about each company, just enough to hopefully enable the rest of the talk to make sense. So Organox is a company that has developed the first automated, transportable, normothermic technology for organ preservation and viability assessment prior to transplantation. Its technology enables the use of organs which are currently discarded within current donation practices, so that's actually what's unique about it. And it was spun out in 2009 by the chair of transplantation surgery in Oxford, Peter Friend, and myself, with the input of a fantastic CEO called Les Russell. A very brief overview of the journey. It is what I'd call a sort of middle stage spin-out company in the sense that it has raised £10 million to date, leveraged by a further £5 million of grant funding. And it's also been a relatively rapid journey by medical device standards. So it started in 2009, 2011 completion of the first fully automated prototype, production versions by 2012, first-in-man clinical trial by 2013, CE marking by 2014-15, phase 3 trials in both Europe and in the US going on currently. And this is what the device looks like. I would try and describe it to you in technical detail, but the best description of it was produced by a journalist for Wired magazine when we did the first transplant. This device is so good, your liver will never know you're gone. So its intention is actually to replicate almost every function experienced by the human body. So rather than actually take the organ out and place it on ice, what you actually do is you place it in a circuit which has a pump replacing the heart, an oxygenator replacing the lungs, and then using whole blood, you actually create an environment whereby rather than the organ being cooled down, it essentially functions as if it were still within the body. And the objective of the technology is twofold. A, to improve the preservation of both organs that are currently preserved and are currently being discarded. But secondly, because the organ is functioning during the preservation period, you now have a unique opportunity to assess, to test drive the organ prior to transplanting it and putting a patient's life at risk. And this is actually what it does, and I apologize that this is before drinks. This is a very good cost-saving measure for food. What actually happens is you start with a very cold organ here, and then at the press of a button, within about 30 seconds, you actually see the organ coming back to life with blood flowing through it. And after about a minute, it has settled back to a state that is pretty much identical to what would have happened to it within the human body. And at that point in time, you can keep it alive for 24 hours in the clinical context and experimentally for 3 days or even a week, both of which have never been previously achieved. And so this is where things got very exciting because you go through a journey that lasts many years, as I will describe, but really it came into sharp focus in 2013 when we were able to perform the first procedure worldwide of actually transplanting an organ that had been kept, a liver that had been kept warm outside the body, into a patient and watch the news go around the world in the span of 24 hours twice. The second company is a more recent spin-out called Oxonics. And Oxonics is a rather different proposition altogether. It is still in the field of medical technology, but it is now in the field of oncology. And really the company was spun out very recently, only 18 months ago, by myself, as a now more senior academic than I was when I started Organox, with 2 people from my research group, Bob Carlisle, who's an associate professor in biomedical engineering, and Christian Coviello, who was a senior postdoctoral researcher within my group, with a very, very capable CEO, Colin Story. And the company raised £2.75 million in Series A, but that was instantly supplemented by £2.1 million of what is called non-dilutive technology strategy board. This is Innovate UK Today funding. And really the key product underpinning Oxonics is what we call Sonotran. And so the idea is we use a combination of nanoparticles and ultrasound to enable better delivery of drugs into tumors. And I'll show you a couple of images in a second. The other unique product feature is that for the first time, we believe in history, you can actually map the drug delivery process whilst you're delivering the drug to the patient. Not afterwards, but during the delivery process. And one of the very exciting features of this technology is that because it's a mechanical effect, I'm an engineer after all, it's a mechanical effect rather than a chemical effect, it's completely drug class agnostic. So it doesn't really care what drug you're trying to enhance the delivery of, because it doesn't particularly care what the chemical mode of action of the drug is. So this is actually what most drug delivery to tumors looks like. This is a blood vessel. These are cancer cells in blue. And the drug is only successfully delivered in green, very, very close to blood vessels in most tumor types and for most drug classes. So there's a problem with actually going out here and killing this cancer cell that is sitting very far away from a blood vessel. And what Sonotran makes it possible to do is to take that drug away from more than 200 microns from the nearest blood vessel and now not only kill all the cancer cells that were proximal to the blood vessel, but also deliver to cancer cells very far removed from the blood vessel. And as I said, another very important advantage is that this is done with what looks like a diagnostic ultrasound probe, co-injection of some proprietary particles, and you're then able, during delivery, of actually seeing where within the tumor and whether you are successfully delivering a drug within the tumor. So what I'll be trying to cover based on these 2 experiences today are 4 things. First of all, a very personal question to each and every one of you: should you be an entrepreneur? The second would be, what would be good and valid reasons for starting a venture? And particularly, what would be good reasons for doing so within an academic environment, which I believe applies to most, if not all of you. Thirdly, what were the things that I wish someone had told me the first and then again the second time I did this? And can I condense them in 10 slides that might provide you with a quick manual on how to do this first time around better than I was able to? And finally, what it is really like day to day on having, I wouldn't say 2 ventures, but at least one. How does it actually impact your life day to day and the decisions you have to make? So let's start with the first of those. Should one be an entrepreneur? Well, the very first question is, are you an idea person? So do you have a great idea? And what defines a great idea can be defined in many ways. Unique, protectable, transformative, cost-effective, and marketable. Now, this list isn't important by virtue of what it says, but by virtue of what it doesn't say. What it doesn't say is novel. I don't actually personally feel that it's absolutely necessary to have a novel idea to build a great business around it. But there needs to be something about it that is absolutely unique, and we will be covering this a little bit later when we talk about unique selling points. Is it possible from this idea to keep others from replicating it instantly? Is it going to have a very, very big impact on whatever area one decides to deploy it in? Can it be done so for a reasonable cost? And do you know at least one person who, if you had it tomorrow, would be prepared to buy it? The second thing is being passionate about translation. A lot of people go into spinning out companies from a research background. And research is a very important endeavor. It's one that people are very passionate about, but it uses a different part of your brain to translation. And I can tell you, would anyone care to guess how old the speaker is in this particular picture, even though he's wearing a mask, when work on the Organox project started? I was 21. Now, I know you will instantly tell me I look a lot younger than I really am, but I can assure you that it's been more than a decade since I've actually been working on this. So what actually took so much time? The science was done within 3 to 4 years of inception. What actually took this much time was going from a collection of tubes and cables which only 3 people in the world knew how to use and worked sometimes and failed at other times, to a concept whereby an organ could be preserved using 3 buttons: play, stop, and eject. And that's what I call an NHS-proof product, one that a surgeon absolutely cannot mess up no matter how hard they try. And that is actually a very, very different sort of task. It is actually about taking something and making it completely robust to a wide range of possible working conditions, rather than discovering a new phenomenon or a new method that will work a few times and enable the publication of a high-impact paper. So there needs to be a passion about translation and care about translation. The other thing is sleeplessness, and that manifests itself in uncertainty. There is almost nothing that is a given when you launch into something like this. And this is actually not to be taken lightly. You have to be the sort of person who can actually sleep through the night when they know they might have to fire some of their best friends by the end of this week. And that is not for everybody, and there are some very, very hard decisions that lie ahead. And they don't just lie there when you're forming the company, they're also there as uncertainty through your funding rounds, through your exit, through your relationships with your potential customers. And so being comfortable and being able to take a step back, take a breath, and actually reassess the situation constantly and calmly is a very, very important skill. And the last thing that says a lot about you personally is, are you investable? And the opportunity to be investable actually relies on a number of features. This is not an all-inclusive list, but the first and most important of those is credibility. In other words, are you medically trained and actually going to try and market an engineering product? If you are, how are you going to convince someone that you know the technology inside out and you're in possession of all the knowledge that is required to translate this product into practice? Are you able to inspire colleagues, investors, customers to actually believe in you and believe in your team in delivering what needs to be delivered? Are you trustworthy? So do people actually willingly assign responsibilities to you and believe that you will deliver within the time frame that you say you will deliver? And this final one, I cannot overemphasize. This is part of the reason why people who have worked in very large corporations do not do very well in a startup environment. You have to be able to do everything without an army of PAs and support staff. And I will show you later on in the presentation some of the things I've ended up doing as an Oxford lecturer and as an Oxford professor in my spin-outs, and I think they will come as a surprise to many of you. But it comes from anything from placing orders to tracking shipments to cleaning up after an experiment to talking to investors. So the levels of involvement are very, very broad because you have very few people to do practically everything. And that is an absolutely key feature of this sort of activity. And the final and most important thing is no one can really do this alone. You need to be able to bring the right key people into your business venture. And it's almost as important to know what you're good at as it is to know what you're not good at and where it is that you need help and external input. So in those areas where you feel innocent, this is actually the place to either get a mentor, come to a Building a Business lecture, or start actually looking for the missing skill sets within your business early on. Now, identifying and covering these skill set gaps is very important. And one of the lessons that I've certainly learned by looking at companies around me is that inventors very rarely make good CEOs and vice versa. Because the skill set is quite different. There's a skill set about really understanding your technology, and there's a skill set involved in really being able to understand the relationship between your technology and the ultimate end user and how you might extract value from it. And very rarely are these two skill sets captured in the same person. This identifying and covering skill set gaps and ensuring good technology transfer is also where a lot of these companies go wrong in translating from an academic environment to the real world. Because knowledge doesn't come with patents, it doesn't come with written reports, it travels with people. And so in ensuring that there is actually a good translation of know-how, it is almost better to do so not just by transferring IP, but by transferring people who have done it before to work in the business full time. And they will, by and large, be able to do things that you can't. So I was very fortunate in my first spin-out to come up with an initial team. And I'd just like to show you the sort of gaps in skills that I'm referring to. So I'm an engineer by training, which means I could just about cope with almost every aspect of the technical device. And the Organox device is by a long margin the most complex medical device ever designed and built in the UK. There's not a single system that it doesn't have. It has hydraulic systems, pneumatic systems, electronic systems. It has to be able to work at the back of an ambulance, on the back of a plane, in a helicopter, in an operating theater. So it is an extraordinarily complex device to build. It could not have been done with someone technical on board almost full time. Then we need the medical knowledge, so the end user community represented, and this was my co-founder and very close friend, Peter Friend. And one of the lessons I've learned through our partnership and friendship over the last 20 years or so is you should never start a business with someone you're not prepared to give a kidney for. Now, it's easy to say in the context of something like Organox, but it is actually true. Your relationship will be tested. You will have to go through very, very difficult things together. And it is important that you implicitly trust each other and value each other in doing this. This was the starting team, but we recognized that neither of us back in 2008 really had any commercial experience. And as you will have noticed, the Organox product is a rather bloody product. It involves blood, it involves plastics. And this is where we went and identified an absolutely fantastic CEO called Les Russell, who is still with the company today, and who not only had experience with blood products, he used to work for Baxter, but also had a couple of previous startup experiences. So he had the combination of the economic experience from a large company and also the ability to multitask and do things uniquely in small companies. The other two major skill gaps was, I told you, Organox is a very, very complex device, and in the medtech domain, that means two things. You're going to have a difficult regulatory journey, and in regulated industries, whether it's automotive or aviation or medtech, you need a regulatory person almost there from the word go, because that is going to influence every technical and product decision you make. And also because the device was so complex, there are about 1,600 components sourced across about 600 suppliers. You very quickly needed an operations director who could negotiate the contracts and make sure that all the process was lined up. So this was our story. We knew which skills we had, and we very quickly identified those skills we didn't have, which were essential within a finite resource to start the business. So you are now convinced it's in your DNA, and you can do this. What are the good reasons for starting a venture, particularly if you are currently within an academic environment? So, first of all, this is a bit like a compulsion. It's a bit like gambling. I think most of you are already sitting in this room because there's a big part of you that really, really wants to do this, and you don't already have a reason, but you just know you want to do it. But the second is there is actually a unique opportunity to change the world around you at a scale where it is usually difficult for individuals to impact the world around them. So I didn't go to medical school because I thought I couldn't stand the sight of blood. This is slightly ironic because I've spent the vast majority of my life elbows deep in blood, more so than most surgeons. However, there are two ways of impacting human health. There is by actually taking care of patients day to day, which is what doctors do. And that is a very honorable thing to do. But there's also the opportunity through one or two transformative technologies to potentially impact tens of thousands of lives. And that was actually the driving mechanism behind both Oxonics and Organox for reasons that will become apparent. But from within an academic environment, there are good and bad reasons for thinking of starting a company. I'll actually take the first two as a group. As you go through a novel research project, there will come a point where you will hit a wall in terms of what can be done within an academic institution. And it doesn't matter if you're an undergraduate thinking of starting a software-based startup, or if you're actually working in a highly regulated industry like medtech, there will be limitations to what you can do within a university environment. So a very good reason for starting a company is to enable translation beyond the walls of the academic environment. Bad reasons include the project running out of funding and actually looking for investor support to continue a research project that cannot be otherwise supported, or because you've been asked to by your academic employer, whoever they may be. Now, what sort of things cannot be carried out within an academic environment? Well, in the pharmaceutical industry and in the chemistry spin-out, you cannot produce a product unless you're able to manufacture it to GMP. So you need to be able to comply with certain regulatory standards to even allow the product to go anywhere near a real person or a real user. And this sort of quality control and process, universities are very, very bad at doing. If you're developing software, you also need a quality system in place and you need documentation in place. And no brilliant programmer I've ever met in a university comments his code, ever. So in order, you have to realize this relatively early on, what are the limitations of the environment in which you're developing these things, and actually try to create an external structure that can then support it for you. Achieving impact through research. So very often there are many, many great research ideas which patients or users will never see unless you take it upon yourselves to bring it to them. And that is actually a very good reason for doing this. And broadly speaking, for the UK and European and world economy, generating wealth and changing the world. But the first question that will then be asked is, okay, you know you want to do this for the right reasons, you have a great idea. Is a spin-out route really the correct way to go about this? And if you're involved in Oxford University, the first thing that you will do is you'll go to your technology transfer office. At Oxford, it's called ICIS. And what will happen, the first discussion ICIS will have with you will try to determine whether your great idea is actually spin-out material or a licensing deal. Now, what are the differences? In a spin-out, you would actually be creating a standalone company to develop and ultimately market a product. In a licensing arrangement, you would effectively be giving your intellectual property with certain milestones to an external party to develop for you. Now, these rules are not set in stone, but they can provide a rough guide as to which route it is worth following. If you have a platform technology, so something that is so broad that you can actually apply it not to your specific initial application, but to a broad range of potential applications, you're probably in spin-out territory. Because if you give it to one partner to develop for you, they'll only develop it for the application of interest to them, and then the rest of the value will be lost out of that process. If, on the other hand, you have something that is very, very specific to a particular area, then licensing is probably the way to go. And the second really good reason for doing licensing is if you need very extensive infrastructure. So for example, if you invent a new imaging sequence for magnetic resonance imaging, it will be almost impossible for a startup to acquire the funds to build an MRI, which costs in the millions of pounds, from scratch. There'll be no reason to do this. You need to plug into someone else's infrastructure and pipeline and distribution network in order to take your idea forward in a time-efficient manner. So if you need very vast infrastructure, this is probably the route for you. On the other hand, if you have a product that is very centralized in terms of its market, where you can see and directly talk to your initial customers, then probably a small business is the right way to go. The competitive landscape plays a very big role in this. Are there people out there to whom you could teach what to do, whatever it is you want to develop? If you can, then again, this will be a lot easier and probably relatively painless. But if you can't think of anyone with the right skill set to develop your product and your idea, you have to do it yourself. And licensing may also be a very good route if you're working in a very highly competitive environment. I know of 3 such businesses at the moment which have recently launched, and they need to capture the market within the next 18 months. Because once that market has been captured, they know that it is not going to enable them to grow any further. So if speed of deployment is critical, going with an existing partner can enable you to move quickly. But if you have the right opportunity at the right time and it's just you, and you can then design your own business plan, then this is probably, the spin-out route is probably appropriate. And last but not least, do you have all the skills? Have you been able to assemble this A-team to create the necessary skill set to go at it as a standalone business? If not, I would strongly suggest not to attempt this and to actually go with a team that has experience in developing products in the family that you're interested in developing. So the other thing that is very, very important is a compulsion to want to see a particular idea reduced to practice and to see a particular idea actually reach the end user. So this is actually the very graph that motivated us to form Oxonics. This is a graph of breast cancer survival without a drug called Herceptin and with a drug called Herceptin. Now, effectively, what it means is that with breast cancer, you have a kind of a peak survival of about 12 to 15 months. By actually supplementing this with Herceptin, you get about another year. But the impressive thing is that you actually go from a very low final figure of survival to one that is 15 to 20%, depending on which study you believe. The interesting thing we learned by looking at this graph is this result is achieved with Herceptin only reaching 1/3 of the cells within a tumor. So the drug is so badly delivered that it can actually only reach about 30% of cancer cells in breast cancer patients. And we had to ask ourselves, what would this curve look like at a very human and patient level if we had a technology on our hands that could actually deliver Herceptin to 100% of the tumor cells? And this is just not a question you sit on for 10 years. It instantly creates a compulsion for you to go out and answer it, because if it works, it's going to help a rather significant number of people. And that's very, very exciting, and that is the reason behind Oxonics. So, having done all of this, having made our assessment, we have now decided that, yes, we have a spin-out on our hands, and we need to start our own business. What are some of the things that I wish I'd known a little bit better than I do now the first time I went around to doing this? The first, and perhaps the most difficult thing to assess with your idea is what is the addressable market. And the word addressable is very important, because by this I don't mean the total market. I actually mean specifically which segment of your particular chosen sector is likely to buy your product or need your product. And that is very difficult, because by definition there is no data on that specific sector because you've thought about it first. So you can't Google it. And so finding exactly how to quantify this addressable market is dependent actually upon realizing who will be the ultimate customer, who is actually likely to disburse the funds to gain access to your particular product. One of the things that makes this challenging is the customer could be completely different depending on different territories. And this is very common in the healthcare world, that the NHS is probably the single largest healthcare customer in the world, but in the US, you actually have to convince private insurance and reimbursement as your ultimate customers. So depending on local legislation, you might have to identify different sets of customers in different territories. Another very important, and I will illustrate all of these points in a second, is are you actually competitively addressing an existing market or a new market? So are you competing with other people for the same customers, or have you, through your bright idea, just been able to create a whole new market that no one had thought about? And last but not least, are you targeting a single market, whereby there is a competitor that comes in and takes you out, it's game over? Or do you have a scalable market and an idea that can actually work in different applications in completely different areas, which makes you relatively competition immune? So I'll give you an example of what got us very excited about Organox. There is, in round numbers, so this is a graph, but it's important to question every single thing on this graph. The y-axis here says US and Europe transplants per year. Why? Because when it comes to transplantation, the US and Europe are the two biggest single markets which you can address with one regulatory process each. The CE marking process in Europe and the FDA regulatory process in the US. So this is already a first choice in terms of my addressable market. I'm only going to look at a subset of the global market. The second thing is, I now have a y-axis that says there's about 12,000 liver transplants per year in these territories, but then I also have this yellow bar. So what is this yellow bar? Well, I told you before that our belief is that with the Organox technology, we can not only improve on current liver transplants, we can also enable liver transplants which are not currently taking place within current donation practices. So the yellow bar actually represents the market which cannot be addressed with any other technology other than ours. And this is now our total addressable market. And as we start modeling how we penetrate that market, one assumption that is possible, and I'm not necessarily saying that that is the Organox assumption, is to say that we will make more rapid inroads in blue into our uniquely addressable market than we will in a market where people can use other technologies. And so being able to really identify what it is that you can uniquely do and what it is that you are going to have to compete with other people against is absolutely key to quantifying your addressable market. The second thing is, what is your product and how can you, in a 30-second pitch, identify its unique selling points? And one of the really great things, I absolutely love this quote, if you need to define yourself in how you differ from the competition, you're probably already in trouble. So if you're having to give people an esoteric discussion as to the little technical differences between your solution and theirs, that is probably not quite going to cut it. So one has to identify what is being sold, what is the revenue model. So I'll give you an example. In the case of Organox, it's a razor blade model. What does that mean? There is a retained unit, which is very expensive, and then there is a set of plastics which are single use. So what I mean by the razor blade model is a brand that shall remain unnamed, where you're pretty much given a razor blade for a very low cost, which is probably at or below the manufacturing cost, and then the return is made on the single-use disposables which you have to use with this retained unit. And it's also used in photocopiers, in inkjet printers, and so on. So you have to identify which type of revenue model you have. You have to be able to tell a customer in a few simple sentences what it is they'd be gaining by using your product. So it can't be a gadget. It can't be a fantastic addition to something. It needs to be essential to the customer. And is there anything else that can come close? So in the case of Organox, what is the major unique selling point? Well, the major unique selling point is after preserving an organ for 24 hours, you get this. You get 4 little graphs that tell you how well the organ is working when connected to a warm blood supply, which we believe is predictive of how well the organ will work when you place it inside the patient. So in other words, a unique selling point is you get to test drive an organ prior to transplant. In the case of Oxonics, again, you have to step back and say there are many drug delivery technologies. If you Google drug delivery, you will be searching pages for days. But what makes the Oxonics drug delivery technology unique is that if it works for cancer drug A, it will also work for cancer drug B and for cancer drug C. So the manufacturers do not need to modify the drugs in any way to use this potentially enhanced solution for enhancing the delivery of the drug. So identify that unique selling point, that unique story. The third thing is intellectual property. And people who start a business are extraordinarily worried about patents. Now, patents are important, don't get me wrong. They're important because they give confidence to your investors that you have something which is protectable. But I'd almost say that the bigger commercial protection actually comes from know-how. And also, other people's patents can be a very, very good thing. So I know you'll have a more specialized lecture on intellectual property. An interesting thing which I found out through this journey is that other people's patents are great when they provide descriptions of fields in the description rather than in the claims. Because what is given in the description confers to you freedom to operate. It's not protected. It has been disclosed. So by actually looking at all the patents, anything that has been previously published means that it is something that someone else cannot prevent you from doing. So when you see a patent that is relevant to your invention, don't freak out. It could be very, very good news, particularly if it's relatively old in time. So you need enough patents to convey the uniqueness of your product and provide reassurance that it cannot be copied. But a patent ultimately gets published. It comes out in the public domain. And the real way in which companies protect their technology is through know-how. So know-how means people. So when you translate the technology from a university setting to a company, you're going to have certain processes which should never be published and should never be disclosed. And those processes are going to reside within the brains of some very, very highly skilled people, and you need to capture them, and you need to make sure that those very key people feel rewarded and aligned with the business so that they remain with you and enable you to use this know-how towards commercial success. So people are absolutely key, and unpublished know-how, it is probably a very, very important thing to think about from the very early days of formation. Inflection points is another very important concept. So I thought when I started either company, this is the picture as an inventor that I had at the back of my mind. The value of the company was going to grow pretty much linearly with time. The first thing to realize is this could happen. And it's a very, very real possibility. It has thankfully not happened to me yet, but it still might, and it's very important to keep that in mind. But this is actually not a real curve. What I actually learned, the thing that I was working towards for days and nights when we started Organox was to build the first prototype. And I was convinced that the second I could take this tangle of tubes and put a machine in front of my investors, they would start writing big checks and congratulate me. Big surprise, they didn't even notice. So the working prototype, actually, from the point of view of someone external to the company, didn't matter at all. It didn't de-risk things. The real inflection points that actually added value to the company was the first time we did a transplant in a human, and it worked, because that really de-risked the technology. And the second thing that added value was the fact that someone was prepared to pay good money for that technology. And these milestones, even though they're specific to one particular company, will pretty much translate. Think about what de-risks your invention and your business for other people. And last but not least, you haven't even started, but you already need to think about how you're going to exit the venture. And this is very important for a couple of reasons I will mention in a minute, but you basically need to be able to tell your investors on day one what is the likely timescale and the likely route by which they will get a return on investment. So even before you've started, you need to have thought about the end. Once you've got all of these concepts together, you need to come up with a pitch. And that pitch is very important because the best way to do it is to actually pick the smartest friends you have, get them in a room, and get them to hear it until they no longer want to see you. And get them to critique it until they no longer want to see you. Because it's this common sense of business ideas that actually really adds value in how they're formulated. Finally, once you've got the pitch, you're likely to go out and raise capital. Now, there is no good advice that anyone can give about raising money, but there is one thing which I thought I'd known earlier on. You are going to have, by doing some research, a likely list of investors. So if you're doing a software company, you're going to have people who like to invest in software. If you're doing medtech, you might have people who like to invest in oncology but don't invest in orthopedics. You will therefore take your likely investors within your ecosystem and you'll create a list in probability of likelihood of them wishing to support you. And this is a guess. Now, most people would go to the most likely investor and work their way down. It's actually the exact converse that is true. You have to have the time and patience to start with your least likely investor and work your way up, because they're going to ask a lot of very good questions, even though they're not interested in investing. And by the time you start reaching the top of your table, you're going to have most of the answers, and your likelihood of success is going to increase. The second thing is you want to always talk to more than one party at the same time, and you want to do this in parallel insofar as it's possible, so that you're actually getting people's independent view of what your business is worth and where it might go, and then compare what you're being told. And a very, very key point that is bound to come up in these discussions is valuation. How does one put a number on what your idea and your intellectual property and your technology is worth on day one? Well, valuation is meant to be a compromise between potential and risk. And really the answer is, it's however much someone is prepared to pay for it. However, it does have some important implications. If I put my inventor hat on, I would say the valuation needs to be high enough to justify your future involvement in the company. However, it's also important that you put your investor hat on and you say, yes, but I don't want to overvalue the business so much at the beginning that I can't actually raise further investment because there isn't enough return on investment for the future investors coming in. And you have to find this happy compromise. And the best advice I can give you on this point is actually map it out to exit. Now, I won't talk you through this Excel spreadsheet in detail, but here's an example of a business which is valued at 5 million and needs 20 million pounds to get to exit in 3 tranches, 2.5, 5, and 10 million. And let's imagine that all goes well and you actually achieve with this investment an exit of 130 million. Let's imagine that you, the founders, are starting with about 45% of the business. Well, that valuation is going to decide how much equity you hold upon attracting 2.5 million pounds of investment. So in order to do this, you need to have decided what your addressable market is and what your likely exit value is. That fixes this number. You then need to decide how much money you need to get there, and it's going to be a shot in the dark. And you then need to decide how to tranche that money so that as you hit inflection points between Series A and Series B and Series C, the value of the company increases from 5 to 15, threefold, from 15 to 30, from 30 to 130, in such a manner that it actually creates the right level of dilution for the stakeholders. What your investors will be looking for is between what they've invested at Series A and what they get back out, they'll be looking for about a 10x multiplier. So you need to be able to deliver a return on investment to your Series A investors, which is about 10x, and you'll notice that that same multiplier actually applies to you. So whatever arrangement you reach with your Series A investors will also apply to you as the academic inventors or the brains behind the technology. Your Series B inventors will typically experience a 5x return on investment, and your Series C investors a 3x return on investment. So this is a decreasing risk profile and hopefully a pretty flabbergastic return on time invested for you. But model it out, because most people only look at what happens here, and you have to play out the scenario all the way through to exit. 2 final things, which is you will need to decide who to involve in your business, because you might have more than one inventor. And you have 2 mechanisms, royalties and equity. And one of the best bits of advice I ever got is royalties are a retrospective reward mechanism. So you actually get someone to pay you royalties on the products you sell, and you use part of that to reward the people who contributed to that in the distant past. Equity is something you deploy in a business to help the people who are going to make it successful day in, day out. So if you have multiple parties involved, you should make full use of both reward mechanisms in order to achieve this. And hopefully, after you've done all of this, there is a moment where you and your 3 closest friends actually launch a company, and you are now ready to proceed. So the final thing is, what has been my experience of doing this? Well, it takes time. It takes, in fact, so much time that when my first round investors had told me how much time I should be involved in the business, I had assumed I'd be there for 2 to 3 years, and then others would take it over. The reality of my time involvement in Organox and in Oxonics is this. So what actually happens is that there is massive peaks and troughs in required time involvement, and it never is the time involvement you expected. And these peaks have a way of coinciding with other life events that, whereby you wish you had more time to do other things. It takes even more time to go from a tangle of tubes to actually something that looks like a product, something that can actually be robust to use for a single user. And even when you think you've actually been through the major challenges, you have to worry not only about launching your company, but about prosecuting and protecting its intellectual property, designing a product, deploying the product. And just as you are starting to catch your breath, your investors are saying, yes, but you don't want to be a one-product company, so what's next? What's your pipeline? And then you will do things in this process that you've never imagined. So I spent my sabbatical year from Oxford as an engineer, and I hope you'll agree this is not what a typical engineer looks like, blue lighting up and down the country, transplanting organs from Scotland all the way down to Southampton. You'll have the opportunity to get absolutely and massively worried about details you never thought you'd get worried about. So this is a facility in Wales that includes one of the few places where you can test decompression. And so we had to go with the device to the middle of Wales with the liver on board and run a series of tests. This is an Oxford professor wheeling a device willingly into a lamppost. Not once, but twice or 3 times with increasing velocity because it is within the medical devices directive. So there will be no limit to the level of detail you'll have to worry about your product and about the performance criteria it needs to achieve. But ultimately, after you've been through all this, and I'm going to ask you to all pause and think for a second what would make it worthwhile for you. What would you want to see on this slide that would actually justify your involvement in a business? For me, it was 2 things. The first was the first-in-man transplant here on the left, and actually seeing a patient who went in like this, looked like this less than a week later. And the second, as an engineer, this is a more technical milestone, seeing something which as a 20-year-old I was assembling by hand and took 8 hours, mass-produced in a factory in the UK entirely to my own design and specification. But you will all have your own individual things to put to this picture, and it's important to keep them in mind because they will enable you to reach that goal. So entrepreneurship is knowing that you would regret it if you hadn't even tried. Thank you very much for your time.